Thank you so much, Prof. Was very positive outlook of our country, and to be honest, I believe that we can be a model for the Muslim countries elsewhere in the world, because I think that the new government had basically, when you talk about state-mandated Islam, official Islam, I think that we are trying to get away from that. I've been talking a lot about it, and in my recent interview, my most recent interview about the Muslim minorities, about the issues of gays and Shiites and other minorities, religious and sexual minorities, I highlighted this particular issue, that you must be able to embrace diversity. And I think that was the point that you made, and it was very good. Thank you so much, and I think it's time for us to open the floor to question and answers. Just come to the mic, introduce yourself and address your question. Can we start with Asma first?
I have just one question for Professor Jeffrey Kenney. For the model for the future to embrace diversity within Islam, I wonder why don't you include Indonesia in the list? Because I think in embracing diversity, Indonesian Muslims are much more advanced than Malaysian Muslims, looking at it at a general level. So any comments about that? Thank you.
I should apologize, especially to any Indonesians in the audience, that I didn't mean to shortchange them. The two that come to mind are probably the two that in my mind have currently been more in the news in struggling to transition into something. But perhaps that's part of the issue, is that Indonesia seems to be doing this rather quietly and not so much in the press. And maybe that's a good thing. But I do think they're probably dealing with some of the same challenges. The difference is that there is a far broader spectrum of Islams that are available and that are being contested in Indonesia. But I take your point and I agree.
Just to continue where Professor Kenney was on, could you also comment on, say, Turkey? I mean, it's obviously different from the others, but again, it's Muslims majority state.
Yeah, I might have said Turkey 3 years ago, but I think given the recent developments, Turkey has become a rather scary example. I've gone to Turkey a lot and talked to a number of people, and I was always impressed by I would say, the secularists who were willing to concede that Kemalism went too far, and the need to back away and to allow religion more into the public space. I thought that was a very healthy development. I still think it is, but clearly the direction in which Erdogan has taken it is not very healthy. I like to think that this is going to right itself. I like to think that this is going to right itself over time, but given the way in which he's manipulating the political system in order to stay in power essentially for life, it doesn't bode well.
My name is Adila. I'm husband's wife, currently working at Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My question is, I like your point about creativity, but I think in USA, of which during Obama presidentship, he was being very creative in terms of giving, civil liberties and also this openness to a more diverse marginal group to sort of like given rights and all that, which then created a more right conservative, making them more stronger and more demanding because they sort of like perhaps like they were too surprised with such creativity, as you mentioned, and I think perhaps that might be a risk, that if the current government are being, are promoting this sort of creativity and, allowing too many, diverse marginal group to gain their rights. This is not my stance, but, this is a wariness that I've been thinking about. So how do you think should we sort of like cater, should it be soft landing approach, or like Turkey, maybe it's just too aggressive that, the conservative starts to, just merging up and making the society much more right. Thank you.
I just had one question based on what Professor Jeffrey Kenney mentioned, that he did basically say that he can see that if you're going to have a better liberal kind of Islam, a modernist Islam, and to cater to the modern situation, one of the things he mentioned was that you should have less state-mandated Islam. Okay, so I was thinking about that term. When you say state-mandated Islam, it's not. If you look at how politics works in many countries, they don't just mandate and say, no, this is everybody must follow Islam and this is the kind of Islam. They don't do it so directly this way. But in Malaysia, typically also, perhaps you can shed more light into this, is that sometimes the mandating of Islam is not as though, because some politicians try to do, this is an Islamic country kind of stuff. But the mandating of Islam comes in a very subtle ways, okay? And Malaysia has a very peculiar problem because Islam and Malays are almost synonymous. Because if you go to the constitution, basically it says if you are a Malay, practicing Malay, talk Malay, you should be a Muslim, okay, by the constitution. So there is a conflating of issues between being a Muslim and being a Malay. So typically the state mandating happens through implementing so-called Malay culture, or sometimes they will call it Muslim culture, now becoming more Arabic culture. So they implement it, like for instance, having children wear the tudung in school or in certain areas, insisting that certain things that are halal, haram should not be in certain supermarkets. To me, these are all also state mandating of Islam. So I was just trying to see whether you have an idea about this. What's your comments about this? Because I felt that the mandating of Islam is more ubiquitous than the way we think.
Khairuddin, thank you. Prof. Asma, you mentioned early in your presentation that both Islam and the West are not monolithic entities. And you described some of the categorization of the groups in Islam from liberal to hardliners. I'm more interested from the West viewpoint. How would you characterize the West and how would they impact on the future of Islam? Thank you very much.
Well, the reason I brought up the notion of a monolithic West in contrast to a monolithic Islamic world is that both assume that these are fixed essences and that we know exactly what we mean when we refer to Islam and when we refer to West, especially the way Samuel Huntington used them as the exact opposite of one another is highly problematic. Especially now that the West actually includes such large Muslim populations, right? So the way Huntington was using it is that he was referring to a West that's miraculously devoid of any kind of Muslim influence or Muslim presence, right? And that's, of course, highly problematic. And the hardliners also tend to conceive of the world in the same way, that they don't actually recognize that there is a considerable Muslim presence in the West as well. So it's not an accurate depiction of historical reality. So this kind of monolithic representation actually doesn't do justice to the diversity of the Muslim world. We have to admit that when we talk of Muslim majority societies, that we are also admitting the existence of non-Muslim minority populations, right, who are very much a part of those societies, historically have been so. Even though we tend to refer to Islamic civilization, we have to realize that the contributions of non-Muslims to Islamic civilization is also substantial. And I'm thinking of, for example, the translation movement during the Abbasid period. Who were the main translators? They were mostly Syriac-speaking Christians, right? But Muslims benefited from that intellectual activity, and their patrons were Muslim rulers, right? So here we have a very positive example of symbiosis between Muslim and non-Muslim populations and creating a common civilization. So I think we need to be more sensitive to these labels, that they're actually far more diverse and pluralistic than these designations imply. And I think if we start conceiving of the West as including not only Muslim presence in the contemporary world, but also considerable Muslim influence. Don't forget, these translations then led to the transfer of considerable knowledge, right, from the Islamic world to medieval Europe, triggered the Renaissance. So it's one thing I emphasize in my classes to my students, that we tend to think of, or should think of, as a cycle, that these civilizations are linked. They're not living in splendid isolation from one another. They have always been culturally, historically connected with one another. And we need to re-emphasize those connections so we can problematize the whole notion, again, of a monolithic, hermetically sealed off Islamic world from a monolithic, hermetically sealed off West. That was basically what I was getting at when I talked about a monolithic West versus a monolithic Islamic world.
Well, starting with the second question, yeah, I do agree that there's more subtle ways in which modern Muslim majority governments mandate or control Islam. It can be subtle, but it's certainly, there's often not a lot of subtlety when they are co-opting a certain group of ulama, a certain group of religious scholars, and making them government functionaries. There's, you know, so, and when this happens, it's usually a government that is using these people instrumentally to promote whatever particular policies that they like. And this happens in many, many different places, right? It's, and then other kinds of scholars who also might have something to say about Islam are sidelined or silenced in some cases. So yeah, I agree. It comes in subtle forms, but when you have a Ministry of Religious Affairs, and that Ministry of Religious Affairs is controlling the voice of Islam, the official voice of Islam for the country, there can be, I'm not saying that this is always a problem, but it often is. It often is a problem. And it often silences other groups. And certainly we see this in, I mean, it is amazing. I don't want to dwell on the Salafi issue, but it is amazing the extent to which so many Sunni countries have been suppressing Shiism. And so, yeah, I mean, going after, I mean, it's been happening in Egypt, unfortunately, too. And this is a government mandate. I mean, and for God's sake, Egypt was once a Shia country, for that matter, right? So it's unfortunate. Going back to the other part about the creativity, I would just say that I think we just had some interesting things happen if you compare the U.S. and Malaysia. I would like to think, and again, this is a biased view, that Malaysia, through democratic means, just righted itself. It went in a particular direction of modernization from the 50s, 60s, 70s on. It went in that direction of the Malayification of the country in ways that might have gone too far. The population realized this and attempted in this past vote to set this right. Now, that's a hopeful reading of it because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, and that's up to you, and I wish you the best. But what just happened in the American election is a different way in which democracy works also, right? So you're absolutely right. It's not one positivist direction that it's all you know, light, it's all good. Democracy can turn back on itself. That's the, you know, when you put the ruler, when you put the government up for vote every 4, 6, however many years, you have to accept the fact that you're not always going to get what you want. But when you do get it, you have to deal with it. And let me just, as an aside to this, that's exactly what didn't happen in Egypt. They got a government that was voted in, and they got rid of it before they let the Islamists trip all over themselves and show that they couldn't do it. Instead, there was essentially a military coup that came under the guise of something else, of a popular movement, and that subverted the potential for that. So I take your point. Creativity can be a scary thing, and it can be a scary thing given the global economics and what's happening to the middle class, but I don't see what else we've got, personally.
Muhammad Nasir from Tuhan Ikram, Malaysia. Okay, I try to be concise as possible. I believe the future of Islam not just rely on the behaviors of the Muslims, but I also believe that it also need helps or affected by the behaviors of the non-Muslims. For example, in the part of the world, the Muslim world, we are encouraged to practice democracy, democratic system, freedom of expressions, and we are getting there. But at the same time, I personally see that on the Western world, this democracy stagnant or stops, whereby the Muslims try to achieve the democratic in their country. The Western, in a way, they stop. For example, like victimization of the Muslims, the Islamophobia, and for example, a recent incident, the case of Professor Tariq Ramadan in France. In the case of like Professor Kenney mentioned, victimization like in Palestine, in Rohingya, not Rohingya, in Palestine, whereby the superpowers sort of not like practice double standard. So what's your comment? Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. This question is to Professor Kenney. Very briefly.
You seem so famous today.
Basically, I'm a bit confused with the conclusions. One of the conclusions seems to be quite familiar with what I've heard before. And the contradictions I see is that while there is no possibility of a cross-national unity of the Ummah, or sort of giving a verdict on the Ummah notion as an illusion, at the same time, we fully agree with Prof. Asma that the assumed monolithicity is an illusion in itself, and diversity is a strength. Diversity, be it cross-religious or cross-national or cross-cultural, it is not a weakness, it is a strength. And if we take it as a strength, because the question here is diversity a weakness, like many seem to see it, which is wrong, or is diversity a strength? So if diversity is a strength, then there is a possibility of the Ummah notion, and certainly that would be better, especially speaking for Middle East, as an option compared to what Israel did a few days ago in terms of the Jewish nation approval in their parliament. So this is the first. The second one goes back to the state-mandated religiosity. I think this one I fully agree that it could be really detrimental because there should be freedom of expression, individual liberties, and in a way, again, if we take this as a positive, then the negative should be, it should be also as a positive the fact that we don't have a pope. and the fact that the Muslims, they have this kind of diffusion of religious authority that you mentioned, but you seem to put it as a weakness again. So which is a weakness and which is a strength? So I believe it should be a strength, but again and again we hear that, well, the problem with the Muslims is that they don't have a pope. So, you know, this is the two questions. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Said. I have two questions. The first one to Professor Asma. It seems that on your piece of presentation, that throughout the years, that the modernist viewpoint has always been inferior to the hardliners and the modernist, to the extent that now you see the society is very much sort of inclined to the traditionalist and confrontation with the modernistic. So why is it that the modernist views, although it has been educated since the 10th century, seems more inferior to the hardliners, which is more prominent today? Secondly, my question is to all the panel. What are your views on eschatology, which is the study of the end times, which I think there is the study from the viewpoint of Christian eschatology and also Islamic eschatology, which has already given the solution and analyzed the problems of the whole world, I suppose, because there's a lot also of ayats in the Quran and hadith by Rasulullah telling about the future, what is going to happen, what has happened and what's going to happen, and which the prominent, very important things being mentioned by eschatology is the works of, well, pardon me for saying it, Dajjal, the evil caused by Gog and Magog. Yeah, so these has already mentioned by both Quran and Hadith, which already has given us has already told us what's going to happen in the future, which is now and up until the end of days. So I think if we were to, if scholars were able to integrate this, the approach that they are using now with eschatology, by the way, I would like to associate myself as a student of Sheikh Imran Hussein, if you ever heard of him. So he's, I think, the most important figure of Islamic eschatology in the current times. Yes. Okay. So, so I think that is the approach that if we're able to, because one more thing, if I may just say something about Surah Al-Kahfi, yeah, which is the 18th Surah of the Quran, which talks about 4 major issues, yeah, about faith, about wealth, about intellectualism and power, which is the 4 great aspects of life of humanity, which really corrupts people. So Surah Al-Kahfi has given us that solution, that if you are able to crack mankind, yeah, into doing the good things based on what the Quran has provided the solution, then things will be good for everybody.
I'm not sure who the question was directed to about the fact that democratic countries in the West are now victimizing Muslims. Was that directed at me, or, I mean, I can give a general answer to that. I mean, I guess I would start out by saying that democracy is not a panacea for all social ills. People have to change. There's no magic formula for effecting social and political change. If you have a certain kind of institution or a certain mode of government doesn't mean that human nature will automatically be reformed and we'll all become angels and, you know, our better natures will take over. That's just not the way it is, right? Unfortunately. You know, racism has been called sort of the original sin of, certainly in the context of the United States today, that has come up quite frequently, but also true of a number of Western European societies where we see a resurgence of racism, xenophobia, but particularly Islamophobia. There's work to be done there. There's no doubt about that. This is a huge failing of democratic countries in the West. And there are a number of people who recognize this, and they're working actively to challenge it and undermine it. I mean, it's the same, I would say, it's sort of the flip side of, you know, problems that also exist in Muslim majority societies where people, you know, at least in theory, subscribe to certain ideals, but those ideals are not lived out in their actual lives or in their treatment of religious minorities in Muslim majority societies and so forth, right? So I think I would see that as sort of the analog in contemporary Western societies. Let's see. I want to take on the notion of ummah, by the way. I don't think that question was necessarily directed at me, but why are we assuming that the word ummah only refers to Muslims? That's not the original meaning of ummah. Certainly not in the Quran, certainly not in the Constitution of Medina, right? Which refers to the ummah of Jews, and that Jews and Muslims actually constitute a united ummah in Medina in the 7th century. Why? Because they are assumed to share certain values, and that the terms of the Constitution of Medina apply equally to Jews and Muslims as long as they uphold the high ideals and principles that are enshrined in the Constitution. The Quran also uses the word ummah in connection with the Ahlul Kitab, right? I think in the preliminary remarks, the person who introduced my book, and I forget the gentleman's name, but pointed out that the Quran actually refers very favorably to righteous Jews and Christians by referring to them as ummah muqtasida, a balanced or moderate community, as well as ummah qa'ima, an upright community, on a par with Muslims who constitute an ummah wasat, a moderate or balanced community as well. And again, on what basis? I think it goes back to what you expressed eloquently, Professor Kessler, about shared universal values, that as long as you uphold the values of righteousness and have, you know, dedication to high-minded ideals and principles that govern your conduct with other people, then you're part of a balanced and moderate community that is equally inclusive of Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and whoever else may be residing with Muslims in that particular community. I think we need to keep that in mind. So we're not talking about, I think I have a little bit of a problem when you refer to talk about the ummah is never going to be united. And I say, alhamdulillah. I think that is a strength, actually, of the fact that there are, you know, there is quite a bit of diversity in the ummah. And that the ummah is actually open to non-Muslims who are willing to peacefully coexist with Muslims and vice versa. That is what our definition of a global ummah should be. There was no mythical united ummah ever. And I would hazard to say this in public that there shouldn't be. I think that, but you know, those differences should be conducive, however, to the realization of certain basic ideals and principles that people universally subscribe to. I think that's a very important observation to make. In regard to I think before the eschatology issue, the gentleman who posed the question, I think you talked about modernists being inferior to hardliners. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I think you mean that they are in a minority position. Is that what you're saying? That their views are not as prevalent as hardliners? Well, I would actually beg to disagree, especially on the basis of many surveys and polls that have been taken. The Gallup organization based in the United States has done extensive surveys among Muslim populations in Muslim majority countries. And one thing consistently came up in their survey is that these Muslim populations are very desirous of living in democratic societies. This was articulated over and over again, it's a very distinctive trait of these Muslim populations. In fact, when compared with populations in Eastern Europe, Muslim populations consistently came out in favor of democracy. So, I mean, that, in itself is very much an idea subscribed to by modernists. And I'm talking about the Islamic world. That's why I said Muslim majority countries. We're talking about the Islamic heartland, not Western Muslims. I'm talking about Muslim majority countries, and that a consistent majority actually voted in favor of, or articulated their preference for living in democratic societies. At the same time, they said they want to live also under the guidance of the Sharia. But there's no disagreement or dissonance between these two ideas, because these Muslims are clearly saying that the idea of democratic forms of government and accountability of rulers to those who they rule over is actually in agreement with principles like shura and bay'ah and ijma', which are, of course, foundational Islamic principles. So I would definitely disagree with you there. About eschatology, I mean, that's a totally different realm, right? I mean, I wasn't getting into certain hadiths that talk about signs of the last times, but I am reminded of one hadith in which the Prophet was once asked by one of his companions, what if you're planting a tree and you know that the day of judgment is imminent? And the Prophet said, continue planting the tree. I think we can read that as a metaphor for continue to build the society that you want to live in, continue to strive to realize the ideals that Muslims strive towards, and don't worry about the apocalyptic future. That's not in our hands, is it? It's really one of the things of belong to the ghaib, the ilm al-ghaib. That's not our concern. Let God, deal with issues of that sort, and let us as human beings continue to do what we are actually placed on this earth to do, which is to act as custodians of this earth.
Just quickly with regard to the Western interference, I mean, I think it's clear that American U.S. foreign policy, perhaps not so much in Europe, but U.S. foreign policy has been incredibly detrimental to the spread of democracy, despite all the rhetoric of the U.S. It's been incredibly detrimental to the spread of democracy in the Middle East. It's undermined democracy consistently, unfortunately, by supporting authoritarian rulers and militarizing countries that use that military against their own population. So I don't think there's any doubt historically that that's been the case, and it's very, very unfortunate. And I don't see it stopping anytime soon, given the current president. It's probably going to get worse. I think there might have been some confusion about how I was using the word diversity and diffusion. The diffusion of authority was not a reference to the fact that Islam needs a pope, or it has to do with more of the structural differentiation that occurs with educated populations, that with the rise of an increase of education, you have a lot of people in other professions that are not necessarily traditionally trained religious scholars who are making claims on religious and challenging, in some cases, traditionally trained people. And personally, I find that's a positive thing. I don't think that's negative, but what it means is that it creates problems, I think, for people to whom do you look for guidance, right? So, and I think that has become more confusing and more challenging in the modern era because of the rise of education. That's all the point that I was making there. As far as diversity is a strength, I have no problems with that. I happen to think it is, and I think one could say that there is unity in diversity, that there's something, and my point was that I think the modern nation states, the governing system needs to advocate that in order to enrich. I don't think that's what they do. That was my point. I think there's great diversity, there's even greater potential for diversity, but I think there's often limits placed on that by the way governments operate to restrict the kind of expressions of Islam.
Okay, I just want to address this question by a fan of Imran Hussein. So, yeah, I think you're not acquainted with his work, but you know, in this part of the world, he's like another Zakir Naik, okay? Yeah, another version of Zakir Naik. But any which way, I want to say that, you know, if you go back to the initial elaboration by Prof. Asma about the differing trends in the Islamic world, and I would say that, you know, like this, and I mentioned about the revisionist trend. And the revisionist trend in Islam tend to have this, what they call, literal interpretation of Nas, right? So this literal interpretation of Nas, to me, brings a lot of problem, right? So when they read the hadith saying that the Dajjal, he mentioned the word Dajjal just now, is a one-eyed person, so they thought Dajjal represents Moshe Dayan probably, or you know, someone with a... Whereas for us, for the revisionists, for the reformists or modernists, we view these verses or these hadith or whatever as metaphorical, in a metaphorical manner. To say that Dajjal represents a one-eyed person that carries, you know, on one side carries the heaven and the other side carries the hell or something like that. It represents basically the worldly interpretation of how we look at it. You know, we look at the world, one-eyed, with just one-eyed. We are not looking at the afterworld, at what is in the akhirah, in the afterworld, right? So, meaning to say as well, when we look at this hadith such as, you know, the time will come when Al-Mahdi will come, you know, to break crosses and kill pigs. To us, reformists and modernists, we believe that this is basically metaphorical. Killing pigs basically were a metaphorical understanding of trying to strengthen the actual meaning of the Sharia of the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. So we are supposed to, you know, not to consume what they call this pork, right? And similarly, breaking of crosses, meaning to bring back the true version of the teaching of Isa alayhi salam or Jesus Christ. So, you know, you can interpret it either literally or metaphorically. And to us, the reformist trend, we tend to look at these verses, you know, as metaphorical verses, as compared to Imran Hussein and Zakir Naik and others from the revisionist trend. So I think this is very important point to make, and I think that we could discuss further. And we have another 2 sessions, and later on, tomorrow and day after tomorrow, and I would like to invite Elma to close the session.
Prof's son to present a token of appreciation to our guests, starting with Professor Asma. Please, any help you need with this? I can keep. Asma, please. This is a version of the translation, Golongan Muslim Pertama, Sejarah dan Memori.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Asma.
My pleasure. Okay.
Thank you, Dr.
All right.
Asma.
Thank you very
much. With this, I'd like to invite Professor Kenney.
I don't have to read it.
And also our translator, brother Baharom. Hazman Baharom. Is he here?
Yeah.
YB Sha'ari, one token, and one book. One book is for Kessler, but obviously Professor Kessler, I guess he's not around for the moment, so we'll pass this book in a matter of minutes. Yes, sure. So 2 more announcements before we move on to our tea and refreshment session. Tomorrow we have a program, same time, same venue. Is it time to look beyond the idea of liberal Islam? The main speaker again, our Professor Asma, and we have a few other distinguished speakers. Please join us if you can. On Monday, same time, at University of Nottingham, Chulan Tower, KL, we have another session titled Islam, Gender and Feminist Hermeneutics. Please join us if you can. With this, I'd like to close the session. Thank you very much to everybody for attending it, and thank you to our distinguished speakers, Professor Asma, Professor Kenney, and Professor Kessler. Thank you, Dr. Farouk, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Enjoy your session with tea.